All right, so welcome everyone to our ZAP and GoSmart webinar. This month, we're going to be talking about grant making best practices. This is going to be from the perspective of a grant maker and for grant makers specifically, but offers a lot of insight into the grant making process as a whole. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the person who's going to be leading this webinar, and that is Jessica Granick from GoSmart itself. I'm going to pass it on to you, Jessica.
Thanks so much, Julia. As she said, I'm Jessica and I'm the program manager for GoSmart. So just real quickly, GoSmart is the grant management tool offered by WESTAF. And WESTAF, as a reminder maybe for some folks, is a nonprofit regional arts organization and GoSmart and ZAPP's parent organization. So WESTAF supports the 13 Western state arts agencies, and like ZAPP, GoSmart is a software as a service platform that grant makers and grant seekers can use from anywhere in the world to host and apply to grants. So like Julia said, I think we may have some grant makers with us today, but I know some folks joining us are just hoping to learn more about the grant process. So before we dive into some best practices, let me take a minute to define a typical grant cycle and the players in the grant world. So there are three key sets of participants in granting. There are the grant makers, typically a private or a government organization like the National Endowment of the Arts, state arts agencies or city arts agencies. We sometimes refer to them as grant funders, and in the GoSmart world, they're most often called the admin because they are the people who seek out and contract with an online grant making tool. And then there are the grant seekers, the applicants. So they're usually informed of grant opportunities because they're in the same network as the grant maker, or they may have searched for available funding in their region. So grants are typically region specific among other qualifiers, but grant seekers usually need to hone in on their city or state when funding. And in our arena, grant seekers tend to be artists or more frequently arts programmers. So they might be the staff or volunteers who run programs in their communities, like after school dance programs, small museums, art classes, art schools, things like that. Finally, there are panelists. So like jurors in the art festival industry, experts in their field are invited to review approved grant applications. And because this process is called the panel, these experts are often referred to as panelists. All right, so turning to the typical grant cycle, a cycle centers around a single application process that is likely replicated year after year. So for instance, the 2022 offering of a general operating support grant would be one cycle, then the 2023 offering would be the next cycle. But this process can begin even before the application form itself is available. So you might hear this cycle referred to as the application cycle, but the application is actually one piece of the whole cycle. And so that first piece can sometimes be the intent to apply. And some grant makers offer an intent to apply an eligibility form, a pre-application survey, or some other form in which they hope to learn more about the applicant or their intentions before they take the time to complete a full application. So here's an example of an eligibility form. An admin can opt to approve the intent to apply if it's built more as a vetting process, or they can set it up such that the system allows applicants to move directly to an application without any approval necessary. If the applicant's intent to apply is approved, or if there's no need for approval, or there simply isn't an intent to apply as part of the grant cycle, the applicant will then access the application. So the application is the only mandatory component of a grant cycle, and the main way that grant makers receive data from applicants. So every grant maker's application is different, and so the pages and content that we see here that makes up the application will likely be unique to this particular application. So if a grant maker offers multiple funding opportunities, they may have a completely different set of questions and pages tailored to the grant opportunity. For instance, an arts fellow seeking funding for living expenses would be asked very different questions than an after-school dance program seeking funding for operations. And the same organization might be giving both of those grants. So they'll run those application cycles completely separately. So if you're a grant seeker, you might see multiple opportunities from the same grant funder. So you might see general operating support, and then imagine master demo is something like artist fellowship or project support. After applications are received, admin for the grant maker will vet applications for completeness and appropriateness for that granting opportunity, and they'll manage this from their admin dashboard. So they might move folks around as they review and determine who's appropriate for that actual grant opportunity. And once folks have either been approved or declined, the admin creates a panel or a set of panels if the approved applications will be divided up into smaller pools for review. And admin will then assign the approved applications to be reviewed by expert panelists. So these panels would include custom criteria like we see here that admin are asking panelists to consider while they review. The panelists can then leave scores and comments, which the admin will be able to review. Then the admin can use that scoring data to complete their selection process, either with the assistance of the panelists or their colleagues, board members, or other stakeholders. Then once selected, admin will alert the grantees with award letters and contracts. Payments may be made immediately or paid out in several installments over the granting season, and that season typically spans a year, but timelines completely vary. Then after applicants have been alerted, they may be immediately tasked with providing some follow-up documentation. So this can be signed contracts, invoices, reimbursement forms, electronic payment information, et cetera. These forms can be received using our flex form process. But sometimes this can happen in conjunction with a mid-season report, sometimes called an interim report, where grantees will begin to tell their grant maker how their money is being spent or perhaps reasons why it's not going as planned. And then finally, applicants are typically asked to report their progress at the end of the granting period in a final report. So this can be a few simple narrative questions or can be a deep dive into metrics of the funded program or project so that grant makers can get a greater picture of how their grant was utilized. So annual programs begin this cycle every 12 months. And though this is the most typical cadence, many grant makers offer biannual, quarterly, or even rolling grant opportunities, and even some that span multiple years. So this cycle may not meet up perfectly at the 12-month period, and it also may not start every 12 months, but this workflow is pretty typical. So let me tell you briefly about some of the ways our clients administer their grants. In our first example, I'm going to talk about the Department of Arts and Culture for the City of San Antonio. They use GoSmart for their suite of annual grant offerings. One example is their base operational support grant, which follows the most typical and comprehensive grant workflow. They open the application cycle with an intent to apply, built as a general eligibility form, in which they ask potential applicants to provide some basic information, such as council district, operational information, IRS documentation, and some basic budgetary details. And then after reviewing the eligibility submissions, the admin team approves the appropriate applicants and invites them to submit an application. Their application asks the applicant to dive much deeper into operational and budgetary information. So they're also able to ask applicants to provide additional documentation and support materials that will help panelists, reviewers glean the value of them being funded. This year, after applicants had submitted applications over the course of several weeks, the department created a single panel and invited 4 panelists, reviewers, to review the 53 approved applications. So from that pool, the panelists selected 35 grantees during an in-person meeting. And then after alerting the selected applicants and managing the contract and award documentation, the department invited awardees back to GoSmart to provide an obligatory state form that's part of like Texas legislator law that can now be housed on file with the rest of the grant documentation. They do that instead of an interim report. And at the end now of the granting cycle, they'll be invited back to the system one last time to submit a narrative about the use of those funds. So this is the most valuable piece for the Department of Arts and Culture because they will then be able to gauge the rate of return on their funding, which will in turn help them make future granting decisions. Then our second example, along with annual grant programs, many of our clients are able to pivot and offer emergency relief funding for COVID over the last 20 months. And a good example of that, of an organization who was quickly able to do that, is our own parent organization, WESTAF. So WESTAF rolled out their CARES Relief Fund for organizations in 2020, as well as a second relief fund for the American Rescue Plan in 2021. And both grant programs were supported by the National Endowment for the Arts, first through the CARES and then second through the ARP Act that were passed by Congress. So both funds provided general operating support to eligible arts and cultural organizations impacted by the pandemic. So WESTAF followed a pretty basic workflow for their application cycle as well, but they also offered an intent to apply pre-application survey, which was a bit unusual. So potential applicants were invited to fill out this optional pre-application so that WESTAF could better gauge how many and what type of applicants they might expect to ultimately apply. This helped the WESTAF team better craft their application as well as to determine their funding capabilities. So after hearing from more than 200 potential applicants, they were able to reassess the original plan to provide fewer $50,000 awards and instead offer slightly smaller awards, closer to $35,000 across our 13-state region, with at least one grant awarded per state. So after making the pre-application available for 3 weeks, WESTAF opened the actual application to all interested applicants, regardless of having filled out the pre-app, which is unusual. Typically, that intent to apply is sort of an entree for 100% of applicants. But in this case, it was built as sort of a separate piece. And then applicants could fill that out if they wanted to, or they could jump right into the application. So WESTAF then conducted an open call for panel nominations, something also unusual, but it helps them gauge a much wider or throw a much wider net and get some panelists who don't usually work with the organization. And they received interest from 90 plus potential panelists. So after selecting 24 arts and culture leaders from that group, they convened over 4 days in 4 separate panels. And after discerning scores, funding was ultimately allocated based on multiplying the average panel score by the amount that the applicant requested. So in the end, WESTAF reviewed 281 complete applications and awarded a total of just over $1.5 million to 44 recipients. WESTAF ARP funds were made available just last month, and grantees were immediately invited to fill out an interim report to submit required documentation, including their signed contracts, as well as payment information. And at the end of the funding period, they will complete a final report to provide a narrative and financial summary. So you can see that regardless of the funding purpose and even the actual content of the grant forms themselves, the grant process has a pretty standard flow. So with that said, there are some great ways to use the tools at your disposal each step of the way, as well as how to avoid some pitfalls. In both the WESTAF and San Antonio cases, the grant funders were able to use that intent to apply and also a flexible form cycle in the case of WESTAF to build, administer, and review these pre-application submissions. So San Antonio used the traditional intent to apply to build their eligibility form, which acted as an entree directly to the application. As I said before, all applicants had to fill out that intent to apply before they could move forward. And this afforded the admin for San Antonio to approve or decline the intents to apply, thus creating kind of a fork for applicants. So approved applicants could move on to the application. So when they logged in the next time, they'd see that their intent to apply is no longer accessible, but now they can actually get into the application, versus those who were declined who would never receive access to that application. So that sort of stops that group there. But WESTAF's use of that pre-application, where they built the pre-app as one cycle and the application as a totally separate cycle, allowed anyone to access the application without them needing to fill out that pre-app at all. So those are both terrific uses of an intent to apply, and the best practices there are really to determine if all applicants should be required to fill out the intent or if it will be optional. Then an admin should determine which questions should be asked before the application. So this helps to avoid wasting anyone's time by allowing ineligible applicants to complete an entire application before it may be clear that they're not the right fit for the funds. As with WESTAF's pre-app, it's also a great barometer for what's to be expected during the application process. So consider if that could be a valuable tool for your grant making plans. Moving on and thinking about when crafting the application, it's best for the grant maker to consider what types of programming or professionals they're hoping to elevate. This will likely inform the types of outcomes they're seeking and further form the questions they should be asking. If a grant maker is hoping to see more social justice work being done with their dollars, they should ask questions that really speak to the grant seekers' work, the demographics of their audiences, as well as the makeups of their own staff and boards. If their hope is to focus more on low budget, small organizations, their questions will likely have more to do with budget constraints, staff makeup, when the organization began, and so on. Grant makers also need to consider the abilities of potential applicants and make sure their grant is accessible to as many applicants as possible. Alternatively, it may be a good time for the grant maker to analyze and recognize who continues to be left out of the process due to cumbersome requirements. And if that's happening, they should change the process accordingly. This can sometimes mean catering to a smaller group of applicants. Many grant seekers run the gamut of abilities. Some may be able to afford professional grant writers, while others rely on volunteers. Many will utilize their own staff to complete grants, but grant seeking will likely be one small facet of their job description. So for all these potential applicants, just ensure that questions are valuable, succinct, and reasonably easy to respond to. For example, most grant funders need to gain a slight knowledge of a grant seeker's budget, but they should consider if they need to know each line item of spending, see every receipt, if they should be asking for 10 years of bank statements, versus being able to just receive grand totals for the years that are applicable, and perhaps some narrative around applicants' hits and misses. Narrative application questions should also avoid being redundant, and though it's easy to add dozens of questions and pages, especially when the process is online, consider which information is truly relevant to the grant maker and the panelist. Many grants grow over the year because grant makers will add questions they feel could have been helpful in years past, which is a great way to assess things, and recognize that things like trends and demographics should be added as they become more important to the story. However, while they're adding questions that meet the times, they're rarely removing or modifying questions that might no longer be useful for themselves or jurors. So they're just sort of bloating their application without sort of trading things out for other things. Lastly, one benefit of using an online granting platform is that applicant responses are standardized, making review and analysis even easier. It also means applicants can sometimes be tasked with literally reinventing their wheel because they're being asked to recreate data that they may already have saved in another format. So rather than doing that, use the system to request existing electronic documents and ask only for grand totals or high-level data points that would be helpful to be included in a mass report. So if it's a data point that's going to help you make the case for focusing on a different demographic, definitely ask that question as a text field in the application. But if you're going to be asking for just sort of a narrative that's likely in most applicants' annual report, just ask them to include the annual report, and then you can take a peek at that and get a good sense of what they do. Grant seekers may frequently also have great audio and visual samples of the work that they do, so let them tell that story through their existing media without having to reformat it for the application. All right, when it comes to the panels, grant makers need to secure panelists, create panels with custom criteria, and determine grantees. So good things to think about all the way through. Panelists can be selected a number of ways, and all of them have merits. Depending on the size or location of a grant-making organization, they may frequently have to keep tapping the same small pool of panelists or even their board to review. And that's fine. You just want to be thoughtful of how many times a year you're asking the same folks to keep coming back. Grant makers may open the panel up to the public, like WESTAF did, and conduct their panelist search to bring in different reviewers who will increase the breadth of grantees to a new pool as well. So it's always a great thing to consider, but there's no question that that is more time consuming than going back to the same well every time. Panelists may also simply just be selected by the granting agency because they're experts in that community in the same discipline or industry as the pool they're being asked to review. The next piece you're going to do is actually craft that panel. And when crafting the content of the panel, consider the criteria that panelists should use while reviewing each application. Craft 2 to 6 elements that should be considered. And some good examples, but by no means comprehensive, are things like access and equity, demonstrated need, artistic and cultural merit, public and community benefit, major constituencies served, organizational budget size, and perhaps even previous receipt of similar funds. So just as with the application, grant makers want to make panels digestible for their panelists. So don't assign 100 applications that are 20 pages each with criteria that numbers in the dozens to a panelist and expect them to review over a single weekend. Consider a reasonable amount of time and split up your applicant pool if possible, so that some reviewers only review some of the applicant pool. Mostly consider the panelists experts in their fields and value that expertise accordingly. Though panelists tend to be volunteers, many grant funders do pay panelists, especially if they're tasked with a lot of volume or depth of their knowledge. Many grant funders also used to consider blind panels a real means of leveling the playing field, but many have actually found in recent years that this tends to lead to much less equitable and valuable grant making. So we've seen that trend disappear over the last few years. All right, the next and perhaps most fun step is awarding. Once you've grabbed the people that are going to get funded, you get to tell them. So the selection process should be a clean process, and you should always alert those who are not being selected, even with a simple mass emailer, to thank them for their time. Awardees can be emailed as a group with a static congratulations letter, and then individual contracts should be dispersed as soon as possible. After the grantees have been alerted, the best thing to do is to keep using the system for all follow-up documents and tasks. So grant makers should ask for applicants to return their signed contract, their payment information, and other documents necessary to the granting process as all part of the interim report or a flexible form. And if the grant maker usually asks the grantee to check in mid-grant to report their work, they can use the interim report to ask additional narrative and budget questions. These should be very succinct, but should provide any necessary information that the grant maker needs to be sure their grant is being used appropriately. However, too much oversight can lead to more focus on reporting and less focus on spending the money the way it was intended. So grant makers should really walk that fine line between report requests and a hands-off approach. Grant makers should always consider gathering data in the final report that helps them to tell the story of their own return on investment. They're likely getting funds from a higher entity, such as the National Endowment or charitable donors, or they may have a board of directors who need to understand their giving trends. So asking the right questions in the final report can help determine how far dollars went and further help to make the case for future decisions or to help lay the foundation for necessary changes to the grant making process. That really takes us through some of the best practices of a grant cycle, and any suggestions made for any of the grant forms, be it the intent to apply, the application, the flex forms, the interim report, or the final report, can really be applied across the board. At the end of the day, you just want to make sure you're being thoughtful of the time for everyone involved, including yourself as the admin. And you want to ask only those questions that are most valuable to making funding decisions, and then asking the most essential to telling your story as the grant maker. One final note I do want to touch on is that along with those practices, there are always timely trends that will arise. And though it's more of a teaser for a follow-up to this webinar, hopefully, I do want to take a moment to talk about a really important direction in grant making right now, which is toward equity and social justice. So WESTAF is lucky enough to house a department of experts who focus on this work. They're also the team that frequently provides grants to artists and arts programmers in our region. They're the folks who administered the CARES and ARP grants, as well as additional COVID funding, and they offer an annual grant for touring artists. So from their vantage point, they're able to be a really wonderful resource on equitable best practices in the arts, as well as in grant making in the arts. So we'll soon be launching a shared resource space for that team, and it'll be a repository of actionable items, articles, podcasts, and more, where you can find up to the moment information about ways to make and keep grant making more equitable. So some examples might be this equitable grant making continuum created by Nonprofit AF and RBC Seattle. It's a worksheet that your team can use to assess your current level of inclusivity, and it sort of unsuspectingly suggests ways to up your game. So if you're a level 1 or level 2, it might behoove you to look to the next column and see, oh, we could be doing even this to really, hit that benchmark. Another example is Dystopia. And this is a podcast from DisArt that raises the voice, visibility, and value of disabled people in the arts. You can also check out our latest blog about the work of DisArt and a workshop that we were able to just do with them in the last couple of weeks. So as you can imagine, this landscape is always changing and growing, and we're so excited to offer a little bit of help on that front. All right, so that brings us to the end. Thanks so much for joining. If you have any questions, feel free to speak up now or reach out to us at gosmartsales@westaf.org or by visiting the demo page at gosmart.org. Thanks so much, Julia, for inviting me to join you today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jessica. And thanks everyone for your interest in today's webinar. If you have questions about GoSmart or the grant making process, I encourage you to reach out to Jessica at gosmartsales@westaf.org. If you have questions about using ZAP or the ZAP system, feel free to email us by either using the ticket field in the header of admin.zapplication.org or by emailing us directly at zaphelp@westaf.org. So that's ZAPPHELP@westaf.org. And we hope to see you in a future webinar. Thanks, everyone.